Linda James Myers here again for part 2 of our reading of Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. We're going to begin starting with In Search of the Afrocentric. The resurgence of an Afrocentric psychology has been an evolutionary process. According to Nobles, we are really experiencing a reclamation, a reascension, and a revitalization. The nature of an Afrocentric psychology calls for a metapsychology that is based on the primordial pattern set in motion at mind's inception. The multi-level pattern of one becoming two, then two becoming one. A principle of correspondence, as above, so below. From human reproduction to the ancient law of opposites, we witness the importance of the process. Ancient Gnostics spoke of the principles of vibration, polarity, rhythm, causation, and gender. On this macro level, at the beginnings of culture and history, the optimal worldview predominated. Later, it became dualistic through the emergence of an opposite suboptimal worldview. On the micro level of the individual, the process is identical. Depending on your worldview, your way of life, culture, and your experience or history, each reflects your progress in the process of self-fulfillment or self-alienation. Self-fulfillment would be 1, self-alienation would be 2, in a particular way, leading ultimately again to oneness. A suboptimal set of assumptions will give you and give way to the optimal. We shall explain this process to clarify and expand our understanding of the optimal, so that we can return to that which was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. As I share my perceptions with you, I am offering at the same time an opportunity to gain greater self-knowledge so that you may rise to a consciousness of self in which fear is unwarranted. When we lack self-knowledge, our experiences derive from ignorance, fear, guilt, anger, anxiety, jealousy, envy, and frustration. But as we gain self-knowledge and cast off our illusions, as we realize our oneness, we shall exercise righteous judgment. A righteous judgment is made when awareness of truth is in our hearts and we make assessments based on love, peace, harmony, and holiness, allowing us to see clearly without unconscious biases. Known by the ancients to be the basis of truth and justice, and as an ethical standard, and the foundation of righteousness is that we are one with the source of all good. The process of growth is a process of becoming one, one becoming two, resulting in 3. In this way, a single perspective, 1, becomes dualistic, 2. As the growth process continues, we transform, unify, and contain, and transcend the opposing perspectives to get to a positive whole, which could be seen as 3 or back to 1. For the purposes of our discussion, however, we shall concentrate only on the first step of the process of growth, becoming aware of an alternative perspective. We shall see that a single perspective is more easily understood when we explore its opposites. We shall also see that, along with the continuum of one to the other, opposites change and disappear. So we have a situation of 1 becoming 2 and the unification of the two back to oneness. Again, we are referring to the worldview that originated in Africa and the generation of the consciousness that is Afrocentric. Within that context, and from the perspective of that, honors reason. Reason is honored. Reason is the unity that contains and transcends all opposites. The study of psychology becomes a study of human illumination, a principle of life, the illumination of the soul. The principle of life is the divine or supremely good wisdom manifest in the creation, government, and redemption of the world. Over our plane of existence, the earth plane, it is the controlling principle of the cosmos. Humankind is a spiritual force not apart from infinite spirit, infinite energy, infinite consciousness, and or God, goddess, supreme or ultimate reality. Such is the all-encompassing macro system of order. Before we pursue these ideas, let's back up and follow the chronology of the resurgence of the discipline, understanding that you may already be getting stuck in some of the terminology and concepts I have introduced. I urge you, be patient, attend to your feelings. We are attempting to analyze what the West would have us to believe is unknowable. Face your apprehension, because most of us have been socialized into that fragmented suboptimal worldview that does not know the one, and accept that you already have within you the capacity to know the one, the optimal, as our ancestors taught. The historical context. I shall begin this discussion by relating the view of an African American witnessing racism in European American culture. There are similar examples in Native American culture and in any culture in which the optimal perspective must attempt to understand the suboptimal environment. As African people, we have been in a suboptimal environment, but our ancestors blessed us with the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the optimal view to survive. As a Black female experiencing racist, sexist oppression, great was my need to understand its cause in order to make sense of seeming insanity. For example, I would find myself asking, what is the mentality of a people who continued for over 300 years to kidnap an estimated 50 million youths and young adults from Africa, transport them across the Atlantic, with about half of them dying, unable to withstand the inhumanity of the so-called Middle Passage, and enslave them as chattel, as animals. The question becomes even more critical when we consider that for several centuries earlier, the European forebears of these very enslavers claimed the beginnings of their culture and civilization from Africa. What was the mindset of the European Americans as they encountered Native Americans, who were basically friendly to them? The European Americans annihilated most or almost the entire race, stealing the land and forcing the natives onto reservations, making heroes of themselves and of their victims, savages and villains. What could be understood about the worldview of a people who claim to be building a democracy with freedom and justice for all, who at the same time own slaves, denying them basic human rights? What system of reasoning would encourage a people to structure themselves culturally and socially in such a way as to denigrate women, our culture bearers, the bearers of all life, and suffice it to say that the plethora of untruths, contradictions, injustices I observed warranted explanation. In addition to these questions, I observed another curious phenomenon, that further compounded the problem. Over time, the European American would distort, deny, change, and repress their awareness of past behaviors and the knowledge of the behaviors of their forebears, to the extent they would accept no responsibility for past actions and refuse to recognize any connection of the past to their current functioning. The European group seemed to exhibit racist behavior more than any other cultural group. No other cultural group sought to colonize the world. Racism, sexism seemed to be an inherent part of the European way of viewing the world. I reason that a society that perpetuates racism and sexism to the point of institutionalization is teaching its adherents to think in a very limited, superficial manner, suboptimally, to say the least. The logical outcome of such a system has to be fear, insecurity, anxiety, and so on. And it'll be a part of every social institution created. With his work on the prejudiced personality, Allport was helpful in contributing to my understanding of prejudice. He outlined several characteristics of the racist, sexist personality. They included moralism, dichotomization, externalization of conflict, institutionalism, a need for definiteness, ambivalence toward parents, and authoritarianism. Could it be that US society, with its suboptimal worldview, has been socializing all of us to have prejudiced personalities? Our system of formal education seems to contribute to the problem by emphasizing what to think as opposed to how to think. Mass media further reinforces racism, sexism by changing history to suit the desired image of the dominant group and presenting stereotypic negative images of non-dominant groups, reinforcing the notion that in our society, the only reality of a certain person or population or group or race is valid. Most certainly, our initial structures, that is social, economic, and political, as well as religious, work to reinforce a worldview that places highest value on acquisition of objects, materialism. Since a materialistic focus is a reflection of underlying philosophical assumptions and principles, what is the relationship between materialism and a racist, sexist worldview, and between materialism and individual psychological functioning? What else can be discerned about the conceptual system that creates the materialistic worldview? Materialism assumes that resources, including self-knowledge, are limited. Such a belief is certain to breed social as well as personal paranoia. Questioning with a sincere desire to know and understand is basic to the process of growth. We must each examine and come to understand the basic assumptions that undergird the predominant worldview of our culture. But now, let us explore another avenue to understanding. Let us step back and distance ourselves from the predominant belief system, resulting from socialization long enough to examine its basic assumptions and premises and the degree to which we individually have internalized this worldview. Welcome back. We so appreciate your listening in and visiting us. I'm here, Dr. Linda James Myers, with our beloved Julius Garvey. We're going to have a conversation today about my first book, Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. And as you know, at our last sharing, we focused on the preface and the first chapter. Today, we're moving to chapter 2, In Search of the Afrocentric. And our conversation today then will center around the evolution and the resurgence of Afrocentric psychology. So in that regard, I guess I would say, when we think about Afrocentric psychology, really talking about a resurgence, nothing that didn't exist before, but it's come back to us because we're back. Yay! And the resurgence is truly an evolutionary process because let me say this way, our ancestors started with an optimal psychology, and it has evolved over time through tremendous struggle and strife and ultimately triumph. And so we're back today. We have to call it an evolutionary process because we need to go back and fetch that which our ancestors knew and bring it forward to this space and time so it can help us realize our greatest and highest good, just as it helped our ancestors realize it. Actually, we're talking about the salvation of humanity, are we not, Dr. Garvey?
Exactly right, Linda. And you know, I want to just break up what you said a little bit into two segments. One is Afrocentric, and then the other one is psychology. And as you just finished saying, why Afrocentric? You know, and the obvious answer is African people are the first people. So, you know, that's where humanity started. That's where civilization started. So when we're looking for answers to, shall we say, the problems of life and living, we really have to start there. And it's not just that it's about African people, because we are the fathers and mothers of humanity. So then it is about human beings and the understanding of humans understanding themselves. So Afrocentric really means human-centric. And we're not trying to be exclusive in any sense, but as a matter of fact, we're trying to be more inclusive because, you know, I'm sure you're going to elaborate more. The suboptimal system is a Eurocentric system that has been developed by Europeans for themselves. And then they have tried to spread this to the rest of us, meaning that their worldview is everybody else's worldview. And they're not the originators of humanity. They came out of a particular cultural, geographic, climatic experience, which was quite challenging, shall we say, and probably had its effects on them and their outlook and their belief systems, etc. Maybe even their DNA. We can't go that far because you know I don't understand the chromosomes to that extent to tell you what's there and what's not there in terms of information. But I think we can definitely say that the Afrocentric way of looking at human beings is the way for all of humanity, because again, we populated the world and we never developed an exclusionary philosophy or conceptual system. So I think that from that perspective, it's very, very, very important. And then when you say psychology, we need to also look at that, because psychology in some sense is a Western term. And I think this is one of the problems that we get into when we use Western terminology and try to use those to define African ways of thinking or belief and ways of being, because they don't fit in necessarily to the definitions of the European words. So, you know, let's get to the definition of psychology and in terms of, you know, how it started. I mean, is psychology really a science of mind, or is psychology, especially clinical psychology, a way of making people feel better emotionally? And when did the psychology really start? Did it start with Freud and Jung? I mean, is this the 19th century? And was there no such thing as a science of mind before the 19th century? Because, you know, I mean, psychoanalysis and Jungian psychology, all these things are 19th century efforts of Westerners to understand themselves in a sense. And again, you know, and we need a discussion on this in terms of really whether Western psychology is a science of mind, because I think that when we look at the Afrocentric paradigm, it is really looking at the mind scientifically to understand what it is and how it functions. And then this is the way you end up with an optimal psychology, when you understand your own mind. And again, we'll come back to that, because I know one of the things that we probably didn't take it up enough was your mentioning of self-knowledge.
Yes.
And we do know that self-knowledge is the gateway or the door to all of knowledge. And without self-knowledge, then we're sort of out there, blindly, hitting at the wind, and we're not going to get very far in terms of our own comfort and prosperity and happiness in terms of our lifestyle, let alone our worldview. So then I'll pick it up again there in terms of where did this Western psychologist start or come?
I'm so glad you brought us back to, first of all, back to the idea of the Afrocentric being universal, because the actuality, and not all Afrocentric theorists see it as universal, but certainly optimal psychology does, the worldview, we are indeed the mothers and fathers of all human culture and civilization. So if we're going to have a substantive theory of human development, we've got to go back to the beginning, and hopefully go back to the beginning of the consciousness of the people who were there in the beginning. And so psychology is Europe doing what Western people have always done, which is kind of appropriating ideas from other cultural groups and claiming them as their own, whether or not they fully get them or not. So Wade Nobles has talked about the Saku Shedi. We are not psychologists. We are going back to classical African civilization and talking about Saku Shedis, people who are interested in illumination of the soul. Now, initially, the psyche had to do with the soul. But because of the fragmented worldview of Western people, that was a bit too much for them to handle. So it got to be a study of human behavior. Clearly, when we talk about an Afrocentric psychology, or a psychology grounded in my definition of the Afrocentric, which is the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, that psychological approach, although we're using the English language and calling it psychology, has a totally different definition. So psychology would be, if we wanted to do a etymological thing with the term psychology, psyche and logos from the Western worldview, we're really talking about scientific study of the soul, illumination of the soul, because the Western mindset is suboptimal and fragmented. It sees us as human beings as essentially a material phenomenon. Our ancestors saw us as essentially a spiritual phenomenon manifesting materially. And as a consequence, the role of consciousness in human experience became primary. How do we structure consciousness to be comprehensive and inclusive of the totality of the I am, or of who we are? So when we consider the Afrocentric worldview or perspective, and we're talking about an Africological analysis, we're bringing the lens of our indigenous cultural worldview to the study of human development. We have to concede that if it's to be of any worth, we've got to acknowledge its universality, but also we have to acknowledge that sometimes we can conceptually incarcerate ourselves when we limit ourselves to the language and definitions of the captors of our ancestors. So I'm one who really likes to define things as I talk about them, alerting people that power is the ability to define reality. We may not know the language of ancient Kemet, or at least the masses may not know that, but they can understand the meanings of Medjugorje, meaning our ancestors understanding that we're talking about words of God, because they saw themselves as one with that divine creative life force. So their thoughts become connections to that. actually, I've gone on and on, Dr. Garvey, and I forgot what your question was.
Well, no, you've been illustrating it very, very good, and dealing with a sort of definition of psychology, because it's not really, in the Western sense, it's not really defined as a science of mind, because if you look at what it comes out of, it comes out of that whole materialistic concept of the human being and of reality itself, and this is the basis of the suboptimal. Well, it's not just a suboptimal psychology, but it's a suboptimal worldview.
Absolutely.
Because this whole concept of materialism, which it is based on, became very, very dominant, shall we say, in the 16th century, first of all, with Copernicus and Kepler, and moving or changing the conception of the universe as Earth-centered, meaning that the universe revolved around the Earth, and changed it scientifically with the understanding that the universe was heliocentric. Both the Earth as well as the planets, Mars and Jupiter, Saturn, and so on, revolved around the sun. So that was against, the Catholic thinking of the time, or the Christian thinking of the time. So it upset the Christian apple cart. And you go on from there in terms of 16th century, you go to 17th century, and you get people like Newton and Galileo, which came on now with this totally scientific view, which was, again, totally materialistic, meaning that the basis of their scientific view was that there was nothing outside of matter. If you could not measure it, it did not exist. You see, and what matter consisted of were these minute particles moving according to Newton's, 3 laws of motion, and only stopping because of friction, or going on interminably because of gravity, and so on. So between them, they were able to explain, shall we say, the universe on the basis of these matter colliding, with force, or being moved by force. And between that and the laws that they were able to discover, laws of motion, and what Kepler and Copernicus came up with in terms of the movement of the planets, there was no longer any room for God. It was now pure scientific materialism, because they could explain pretty much everything that you could see and feel and hear. And of course, that went on in terms of electromagnetism and so on and so forth, and then going on to search down to cellular structures and what have you. But this is the basis of the turning away, shall we say, from God. God is dead. And all of those other things that are not material, meaning, things such as values, things such as ethics, things such as morals, things such as, basic human relationships. Well, happiness and love, you can't measure those things. Those are gone.
Yes,
so
yes.
you have this scientific materialism, which comes on into the 19th century. And then you have Darwin. And Darwin now, in order to explain the beauty of human nature and all the variety of our species, so, well, look, all that happened is, okay, first of all, they said there was this Big Bang and so on. And he said, well, after the Big Bang, everything is just chance mutations. So there is no intelligence behind the universe. And again, he confirmed the death of God, shall we say, with Darwinism, meaning that we are here by chance, and we survive by the fittest. That was his doctrine, the survival of the fittest. And if I can remember the alternative name, it wasn't just an explanation of human evolution, but I think the alternative name, which they don't tell you about, which is the survival of the favored races.
The fittest, they say, survival of the
The
fittest.
competition, you see. So then we got into social Darwinism as the philosophy behind scientific materialism. So you had the wedding of those two things. So here we are, Linda, on this planet Earth, and us purely by chance, and by chance mutations, right? Living in a totally materialistic universe, and the characteristics that should be encouraged are those that favor the individual or the races in terms of survival. Now,
That's
that's
crazy.
the basis of the suboptimal worldview is
It's
dog eat dog.
absolutely true. And you know what's so sad is that that worldview is with us today. And so we have psychology now becoming the study of human behavior, because that's the only thing we can count and measure. And as you pointed out so brilliantly, for them, if you can't see it, touch it, taste it, hear it, and smell it, count it and measure it, it doesn't exist. That spiritual aspect of being has been fragmented, segmented, fractured, and divorced. And in actuality, it's that spiritual aspect that our ancestors always knew was most essential. In fact, as you were talking, I was thinking about the Dogon people who had discovered the star Sirius long before the European even knew it existed. And they even said that actually the Sirius B was the essential point around which the universe evolved. All planets were somehow influenced by that because of its density. So I think that's a brilliant characterization of the suboptimal view. And also then leads us to what is this other way of viewing the world, where we're knowing not by counting and measuring, but through symbolic imagery and rhythm. And the way that makes sense is that all that is basically representing or symbolizing that spirit, creative life force, which is what we all are, what all is. And so for the European mind, the suboptimal mindset, that's unknowable. And what's so funny is when I first wrote this book some almost 40 years ago, you couldn't talk about spirit or spirituality because it's like, oh, what's she talking about? Now it's kind of snuck its way into the general mainstream to a minimal extent. But the fact that modern physics, quantum physics, has definitely pointed to what our ancestors already said, which is there's no out there. So whatever it is you're thinking, you're counting, measuring, and even seeing is going to shift by the time and the perspective you're using to examine it. So I think what's so exciting to me, Dr. Garvey, is that we're seeing a convergence of knowledge around that which our ancestors always said. And the scientific reality of quantum physics or neuroscience is still not culturally grounded for them. Yet for us, it always has been the cultural grounding for truth, justice, righteousness, moral order, moral development, ethical standards, and all of those things which we still see in the contemporary Western cultural context virtually don't exist.
I think, Linda, that's so true. And as you say, you wrote this book, 40 years ago, but we can easily fast forward to now to see how the suboptimal worldview has played out, so that we can put it to bed, because it's playing out now in the conflict in Ukraine, where one superpower is trying to destroy another superpower, if you will, or not so superpower, to increase its own hegemony over the universe and to get more and more and more of material wealth and material prosperity. But at the cost of what? At the cost of the possibility of nuclear war and the destruction of the whole planet. And if you look at the other, suboptimal aspects What's the economic system based on? It's based on that same, Darwinian, social Darwinism, where you claim all the resources, and you explore for all the resources, and you go to countries where people have existed for thousands of years, and you call them savages, and you say they weren't there, and it's your country. So you steal whole continents, and you destroy whole civilizations, and you commit genocide, and you destroy the earth. Right now, our soil is being destroyed by the methods of farming that do not understand the natural cycle in terms of how nutrients are redeployed into the earth and so on. So all of those so-called scientific systems that are based on pure materialism are falling apart. And, because again, we're poisoning our people with the food. We see obesity, in 60–70% of our population. We see so-called non-treatable diseases that simply get treated symptomatically, and people go on and on with their diabetes, their hypertension, their strokes, their cardiac disease, their cancers, and so on and so forth, when all of these things relate to the environment and to lifestyle and to food. So we're creating our own diseases that are not there naturally, and we're reducing our natural resistance. And so we see viruses coming up. And so these are all end results of the suboptimal worldview.
No doubt.
I'm a physician, and most of my patients who are over 50 that came into my office, they were on 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 medications, one for this, one for that, one for the other one. And they were certainly not healthy, and this is the way in which we treat disease. We don't really treat it at its root. We treat the symptoms. And I think that's the same thing with the type of psychology, the clinical psychology that we've had, which is the same way we treat the body, it's the same way we treat the mind. We try to make the mind feel happy, so to speak, regardless of the situation that it faces, yes, which are created by the culture. So, we have something for depression, we have something for anxiety, we have something for this other phobia and this neurosis and so on. Of course, if you go off the deep end, then they put you in a hospital. Or I even remember the days of electroshock therapy, which was horrible. I mean, I saw the results of it when I was in medical school. I remember, I won't go into the but again, we need to put this suboptimal psychology to rest, because it is what has created global warming, climate change, 2 world wars. It's why America has been at war for the last, 50 years or whatever, spending billions of dollars. And it's why there are all these conflicts and people dying, etc. And again, we're once again on the brink of nuclear extinction, shall we say.
This is so true. This is true, so true, because to the extent that suboptimal view has been so pervasive and the global humanity has been force-fed, we're just seeing the ways in which that view, as you point out in medicine, has been transferred to mental health, and we're symptoms oriented. So if you go to a physician and you don't have a symptom, he's going to be hard pressed to treat you because we need a symptom. So Big Pharma can come in and tell you to take this, that, or that. And it's going to have, what do they call them, side effects, yeah, that are probably going to be worse than the symptom you had. Just, makes you want to holler, as they used to say, throw up both your hands. But the good news is, as you keep saying and pointing out to us, it's time to let that fragmented suboptimal view go.
Yeah.
But you can't let go of something that you really aren't fully conscious of, aware of, and know how it works. Mm-hmm. You gave so many brilliant examples of it destroying humanity at this juncture, having us on the verge of potential nuclear war. But Dr. Garvey, the reality is, as much as we've been buying into that worldview as we try to help people and move them toward health, that suboptimal view doesn't allow you to have a conception of what health is. Mm-hmm. So here you are trying to help people move towards something that you have no idea mm-hmm. what it is, what it looks like, how it works. And so we're just thankful to our ancestors that we can come to the rescue and bring some knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. So people do have a sense that they are more than how they look, yeah. or what they own, or where they live, or the car they drive, or their position, on and on and on. Because in actuality, I just heard statistics the other day that said in the last 3 years, the incidence of anxiety has doubled. Mm-hmm. Now, we still have the same medications. We still have mental health workers trying to help people deal, but what we do from that fragmented suboptimal view can't work because it's premised on a false assumption. Mm-hmm. First, about the nature of reality. Second, about the nature of knowledge. And most importantly, what's of value? Mm-hmm. Highest value isn't in acquisition of objects. We know you get some, you want more and more and more. Highest value is in realization of one's true purpose and identity as a manifestation of that creative life force who's here. We're here to help ourselves and one another because we're interconnected and interdependent. And this is supposed to be heaven. Not in the Christian sense, but in the sense that if heaven is where God is, God's in us, and we're supposed to create that realization and that reality right here, right now, in present day. But that's so far from where most of us have been socialized to be, because all of us have been brainwashed into that fragmented suboptimal view. And we don't even know what an optimal view looks like, or what it should look like, or what should happen. And it's really disheartening and sad that the suboptimal view has become so pervasive. We have people who have no idea about what's true. Truth has become arbitrary. People can follow someone who's just clearly a liar and someone who's a manipulator and think that's okay, want to deny us the opportunity to pursue the truth of our history, don't want people to speak about injustice. So the suboptimal worldview by its nature is an illusion. It's an illusion because it's premised on a false assumption about the nature of reality. But it's the kind of illusion that can allow people to enslave other people as caste chattel, colonize and steal other people's land. And it also allows us to be so self-deluded and in such denial that we don't see, particularly if we're one of the more economically privileged, that there is a serious problem. Hopefully, though, Dr. Garvey, so much has happened and is happening, people are beginning to realize that this doesn't work. This is something wrong. At such a deeply essential level, we must change. And so that is our purpose with an optimal psychology, to inform, because the impetus for my even pursuing it was trying to understand how people could behave so badly. How do you kidnap and traffic millions of young people to America as cash chattel to build your wealth and think that's okay? Oh, that's the same way you can have 1/10 of 1% of the people owning 99% of the wealth and think that's okay. The mindset hasn't changed. And it's not going to change. What has to change is what we have to change by taking our power back and thinking for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely, Linda. You know, our minds have to change. And as my father said way back in 1937, we have to liberate our minds from mental slavery, because whilst others may free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. And this, is important for all of us, because I think without that understanding of mind, then we'll not be able to carry out the self-transformation. And this is what is or will be at the basis of what you're saying, that people are waking up. People have to wake up to the suboptimal and understand it, but they've lived through it, but they now have to understand that there's another way, which we can call it the optimal, psychology or the optimal worldview. But they have to learn that, and they have to embrace it. But it's a process.
Yes.
It's a process of knowledge and transformation and becoming. Fortunately, shall we say, for our ancestors who were the original human beings, it was there. It was the natural thing to do and to be, and therefore it was developed, shall we say, naturally. You were born as the image of God, and you grew up as the image of God, and you understood the oneness with everything else, and that you were this spiritual entity manifesting in the physical world along with other physical entities, but you were interconnected through spiritual networks and intercommunicate. In that way, you could communicate non-physically and even non-verbally, and so on. So that was intrinsic or endemic in us as the mothers and fathers of civilization. And of course, we wrote about it, and we had it in our universities at Hermopolis and Heliopolis and at Abydos or Thebes, and so on. And we spread it around the world, to India and to China. And we gave as much as we could give to Greece and to Rome, but they couldn't necessarily absorb it, not in its fullness, and there were distortions. But we do have that as a basis, and we have to, Sankofa, go back and fetch it, and put it in a language that our young people can understand. Well, young or old, doesn't matter, that our people can understand at this point in time. Because what we're talking about is reality, and it is the mind that creates the reality that you live in, and if your mind is captured by incorrect information and incorrect conditioning, then the reality that you're going to see is going to be a distorted reality. It's like if you're wearing glasses and your glasses are cracked. I mean, you're going to see a world that is distorted. And that's exactly what the situation is with the mind, because our minds have been captured by a culture that is based on conceptual system, based on a belief system of materialism. Now that has to be changed so that we can deconstruct that mindset to allow our mental faculties now to be used by that spiritual self, which is one with the source and one with the ancestors and one with every living thing. And this then is what Ma'at is all about, who is spreading her wings there behind you. Talk meaning it's harmony, it's interconnection, it's order, it's interdependence, it's joy, it's happiness, it's justice, and these are all of the things that you experience and you're able to manifest with the optimal conceptual system or the optimal psychology. But you need to go through that process of deconditioning of the mindset from the suboptimal to the optimal. And the optimal is really freeing your mind.
It is true.
Soul or spirit to manifest.
It is absolutely true. And I think the idea that it was a deliberate, concerted effort on the part of our captors, or the captors of our ancestors, to take control of our minds. They weren't just willy-nilly about it. They had a psychology of oppression process that was designed to keep us from seeing the world from an optimal conceptual system and worldview and shift to their suboptimal. Principally because if you see the world from an optimal view, you're very hard to control. You are very hard to control when you think for yourself and you define reality for yourself. So making that shift from the suboptimal to the optimal, it's important to recognize, first of all, there are people whose job it is to make sure you don't make that shift, to make sure that you keep that fragmented suboptimal mindset that is so toxic and filled with pathology, because when you keep that mindset, you're easily controlled. I think it was last time you talked about Carter G. Woodson saying, if you control the way people think, you control the people. You don't have to relegate them to an inferior status. They will seek it for themselves. So be mindful that there are those people in power, particularly economic power and political power, whose job it is and whose intention it is to keep your mind controlled. And the decision to begin to become aware of that is revolutionary. And the decision to pursue the optimal view is absolutely revolutionary and is one of the most important things that you can do relative to ensuring not only your salvation, but that of humanity in general.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate our discussion and look forward to us, continuing this and getting deeper into the optimal worldview and the optimal psychology, shall we say, because of course, that is why we're here. And I think we have appropriately buried the suboptimal psychology.
That's our hope, yes.
We'll bring it up every so often, but only to rebury it as a memento. But we'll go forward certainly with how this optimal psychology functions for us on a daily basis.
It is.
And how it shapes our lives as individuals and how it shapes society. Because ultimately that's what it's all about, because we don't live individually in a cocoon. Yeah. Again, we refer to the suboptimal system where the individual is somehow king. You can do whatever you want, so to speak, as an individual, and that's what freedom means. Well, that's not what freedom means at all. That's license, without responsibility. You can't. You live in a society, and it's about relationships, and that's what the optimal, psychology is about: our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with each other, and our relationship with the environment, and and of course the
absolutely true
source. And it's a oneness. That's the essence of that relationship. Is our oneness.
It is true. It is true. In fact, the only reason the suboptimal was allowed as a teaching tool, the opportunity for us to become edified and develop to the fullest realization of who and what we are. So we'll allow it to serve its own purpose, its ultimate purpose, which is for edification and growth. And it is the developmental process. So be patient with yourself as you choose to step outside of the fragmented suboptimal view and reward yourself. And make sure in this process that you're feeling that peace, that passive understanding, as they would say in the sacred text called the Bible, because that peace is going to open up your creativity and going to open up access to that intuology, which is the human and spiritual networks that connect us and make us interrelated. And as you were speaking, Dr. Garvey, one thing that came to mind is what's a good example of the transfer of that intuology to present day? And what came to mind is jazz, the African-American art form, where actually people are being and listening to that spiritual aspect and improvising, but they're not improvising just out here somewhere. they're improvising and listening to one another and creating brilliant art form that is amazing for people to create coming out of chattel enslavement and legal domestic terrorism. That's where it emerges from. So as we
basically, I'll cut you a little bit, basically that's the call and response. And basically that goes back to Ubuntu. Because, because you are, I am, and because I am, we are. So there's this dialogue, and which is beautiful. Your illustration is fantastic. And of course, I love jazz.
Okay, I didn't know that. I do too. I do as well. How are we doing for time and actuality?
I think we're good.
Okay.
And we can reconvene with your next chapter as we go deeper into the optimal psychology.
Absolutely true. Well, thank you again, our listeners, for joining us, and please join us next time. And we're going to create the option for you to join us in conversation with your comments and your questions. So we're eagerly looking forward to that as well. Peace and blessings.
Likewise.